Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm here with my husband, Sush.
Hello.
And we're going to be doing a discussion and review of the book Good Talk by Mira Jacob. This is a book that we both read recently and we loved it. It was so good and there's so much to discuss in this book. So just to give you a brief introduction to it, it is a graphic memoir in conversation. So really what it is many different conversations that Mira Jacob has had with all sorts of people in her life, her parents, her husband, her son, strangers, and how that has shaped her and how that has expressed a lot of interesting aspects of her life and her identity, especially related to race and to being an American. She is a second generation Indian American, so her parents were immigrants from India, and that really influences a lot of those experiences and conversations that she has. So we're going to talk about so many different things that we noticed in this book and why it spoke to us so much. So the first thing that I think is so unique about this memoir is the style that it's written in. So this is a graphic memoir. It's done via artwork, but it's very different from a lot of the other graphic memoirs that I've read, which are more of a comic book style. This one has instead just still drawings of her and the other people in her life, but they don't change. It's always the exact same one for different ages. So she has one drawing of herself from when she was, in elementary school, one drawing of herself from high school, one drawing from college, etc. And so those also provide a lot of context as to what stage in her life she was in. The other thing that I think is really interesting about the way that this is drawn is the backgrounds. So sometimes they're drawn backgrounds, but sometimes they're also actual photos. And the highlight in every one of these is always the conversation. I really like the way that the artwork and the layout of each page just highlights who she was at that point in her life and those conversations. I also think that the way that each chapter is organized is really fascinating because this is not a chronological memoir of her life. It's more just pieces of her life, little conversations, and she jumps back and forth throughout time, starting with something from, maybe 4 years ago, and then going back to when she was a teenager, and then to her college days, and then to when she was in elementary school. It just jumps around in time. But as we move through the story, through all of these conversations, it's building up this understanding of her experience as an Indian American. And I just really love that storytelling style.
And kind of to continue what you mentioned, one of the things that I really liked was how there were these conversation threads. She'd have the beginning of a conversation with her son, and it would draw that chapter to a close. But then you would get to see a little bit more about her background, events that basically inform who she is and how that affects her viewpoint coming into this conversation. And then you'll see a little bit more of that a little further down. And so that kind of just develops as things go on. And so I thought the story structured was very intentional and done really, really well. This also reminded me of Fun Home, another graphic memoir written by Alison Bechdel. And that also has the same idea of non-linear based story, but then kind of exploring various concepts and then using that to kind of tie into why a person would have said something in some future, piece. And so I thought it was done really, really well. So another thing I wanted to talk about was a notion of definitions. When Shannon asked me to kind of join her in this review, one of the first things I was trying to put my hand on is certain definitions of generations of immigration. And so, because I've heard conflicting terminology used by different people, and so I wanted to be sure we kind of had a notion of agreement on that. Went down the Wikipedia rabbit hole and a bunch of other places, and this is actually a very interesting topic of discussion where there are contrasting accepted definitions.
And I think that just as a background, this is really interesting because Mira Grant is of a different type of generation of immigrant than Sush, since Sush was born in India, grew up in India, whereas Mira Grant was born in the US and grew up in the US.
And so basically the thing here is that there is a notion, I'll go first with my definitions and then I'll kind of talk about various other definitions that exist. One definition goes, a first generation immigrant is a person who is born and grows up in a country outside of the destination country, emigrates to a new country, and then becomes a citizen there. So this would be a first generation. Then their kids would be a second generation immigrant. Okay. Now, apparently, both Oxford Dictionary as well as Merriam-Webster offer this definition as well as an alternative definition, which is that the first generation immigrant is the kid of that immigrant, so to speak. So, and saying that this is the first generation born in the new country. What is also interesting is there are other definitions which basically say that that kid born in this new country is not an immigrant, having been born in that country, and therefore should not be classified as a generation of immigrant in the first place. I find that funny because one, I think it comes from a side of inclusion, so to speak, to not cast them as the other if immigrants are being cast as the others. But in so doing is casting immigrants as the other, and therefore is not actually helpful. And the second aspect of it is there is a certain amount of erasure of background associated with it, where it's like, sure, you're saying you're American and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, sort of a thing, which is to be lauded. But at the same time, there is a certain amount of denying of that person's experience in that kind of, layout. So that is, I think, it has tones of a lot of well-meaning inclusion that I have seen. And I do appreciate that, but at the same time, there is some interesting aspects to that. There's also further definitions that I'll mention. What is called a 1.5 generation. And this is typically people who are stuck in the middle, so to speak. They have enough cultural roots to their country of origin and to the destination country, which means that they are neither in the mold of a first generation immigrant, as I use the definition, or in the mold of second generation immigrants. And so that is one interesting kind of common, lived experience. The other kind of common lived experience, and I'm one of these to an extent, is when we feel not necessarily the connection to either side, but the disconnection to either side. Okay, where you feel like you're not Indian enough and you feel like you're not American enough. And so that also causes this 1.5 generation kind of a thing. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, people define 1.25 and 1.575 generations based on, it's like, oh, kid came here when they were 5 years old, and that sort of a thing. Or how close were you to adulthood when you have to kind of match with the other, culture. In all of this, what I was thinking was I came across this talk where Rebecca Rowan Horse talked about the authentic Native American experience being one of not connecting to your roots, of connecting to many other cultures and searching for your roots. And it's interesting that that behavior is very much mimicked with a lot of the immigrant experiences as well. And I think that also has a lot to do with cultural identity. In this, I also wanted to mention that the notion of generations also has a linguistic background. And
yeah, so I'm familiar with talking about generations in terms of how that affects language acquisition, since that's kind of one of the things that I studied when I was in college. And so I'm much more familiar with generation, the first generation being the people who are adults and move to a new country, generation 1.5 being children and teenagers who move, and then second generation being people who are born in the new country, because when you move, really affects your language acquisition. So if you are born in a country, or you're that kind of generation 1.25, where you're a very young child when you move, your language acquisition will be basically native. But if you're generation 1.5, you might end up sounding native, but your literacy skills may just be a little bit delayed, or you may have a slight accent, or you may never develop adulthood language proficiency in your mother tongue in a way that normal adults would in that country. And so sometimes you can actually have real issues with literacy. So anyway, I'm familiar with it from that aspect. So when Sush brought up this interesting difference in definitions, I'd never even heard first generation being applied to people who were born in the US. So it's very interesting the way that these definitions represent a lot of the beliefs and value systems of the people defining. So one of the themes in this book that really picks up on this idea of how we define generations is this idea of being American enough. This comes up in a lot of the different conversations that Mira Jacob has with people, because she is somebody who's born in the US, but she is visibly different because she is brown. And so there's a lot of different conversations that she has where she sees herself as American, but sometimes other people don't necessarily see her as such. And so there's just some really interesting discussions that she has with other people, or interactions. I think one of my favorite chapters in this book is about elementary school and her teacher, and an essay that she wrote about hammers, and the way that played out, and the way that she was kind of shown as a child if she was American enough. It was very, very impactful. I really liked that story and the way that it worked. And even as an adult, those questions of where are you from, right? Those are so interesting. Just this questioning of her right to be American if she's not white. So I really liked a lot of those, and especially too with her son. Her son is now third generation Indian American, but also is half white Jewish because her husband is white and Jewish. And so is he American enough? So lots of really interesting discussions of that judgment of what counts as American.
And I think kind of going from there, there's a notion of either or of identities when it should be both and. And that's kind of, I think, one of the themes that goes down, which is that of intersectionality. So I think the notion here is there is this, the topic of intersectionality is something that I think has been explored a lot in various other contexts, and I think is also explored a lot over here. Other books that I kind of recommend in general for intersectionality discussions, probably actually the most, relevant book that I will recommend for this that comes to mind is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. I read this a couple of years back, and it was just fascinating because it's different perspectives essentially on intersectionality and how it affects people's lived experiences. And the idea behind intersectionality is very much the one that you are the sum total of a lot of lived experiences that you have. And yes, it is entirely possible to be disprivileged in a couple of areas and still be very privileged in yet other areas. And it's important for us to kind of question that and think about that, and to try not to be blind about places that we are ourselves privileged. And I kind of also wanted to add one more book thing over here, which is slightly bit of a tangent, but it's fresh in my mind because I just read it recently, which is Nova by Samuel R. Delany. And this is set in the 32nd century. And basically, humankind has gone across various star systems and things like that. And there is this refrain, this constant bemoaning in the background by various intelligentsia about how there is no notion of cultural identity anymore because people move around all over the place. Okay? And there is one moment in the story where it's kind of like almost a side discussion sort of a thing. A character has an epiphany about how wrong that is, because each of us basically carries around a cultural lineage, and we are the product of our background, of where we grew up, what experiences we've had, what kind of tribes that we have moved through, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, it's like the idea of identity is a personal one in that sense.
And you know what, too? I think often this reminds me a lot of the discussions of language purity. So often you'll have people who talk about like how, we're messing up our languages by having all of these changes and these borrowings and all of this sort of stuff. And they're like, we don't have our language anymore if we allow it to change in these ways. And people feel like this about culture. And this is really not a discussion about what makes culture. It's a discussion of purity, which is all about power and control and privilege. Sorry, this gets me on a rant, because if you ever look at the history of language and culture, you'll see that it's never static. It is always moving. It is always changing. And the idea that there is a diluting of culture because there are changes and modifications is so crazy. For example, food. You look at Indian food, and can you imagine Indian food without tomatoes and potatoes? Those were New World crops. They were brought in. They've not existed forever and ever. Even things like Christianity, which is so influential to a lot of Western culture, that didn't exist before 0 BC. I mean, it's just like there's so much that we define language and culture about that is always in flux. And anytime you have somebody saying that this can't be defined, what they mean is it can't be defined with the static version of it that they are using because that's the one that they grew up with and identify with. And so it's all about their privilege and getting to say what counts. So yeah, anyway, end of rant.
And actually that also hits upon the point that character makes in Nova, which is this notion that when you have a notion of a broader cultural identity, it is when you choose to reduce the identities of all the people living over there to one thing that they have in common in that particular area. And so in a sense, it is a notion of cultural violence, of cultural oppression, rather than one of cultural solidarity. And I think that's kind of an important thing to kind of consider in kind of like how we, walk through life.
And I think also in this book, in the way that people are trying to reduce Mira and her son to one identity, to say, oh, you're Indian, and just not acknowledge that she is also American, that her son is also Jewish and also white. I do like this discussion about how that reduction is an offense, really.
And I think coming to the character in person here, I think what is really beautiful about this book is that it portrays so many instances of others reducing her, but there's also reflection in how she has reduced others. Yes. And there is more than one story that does that, and it goes, oh, kind of a thing. And I think that is really beautiful because this is very human, and it's important to reflect on these things. One last thing I will mention about this thing is where I connected heavily with the book. In that, yes, I connect with some of her experiences, and I don't at all with many of the others. But I think one of the places that I connected the most is kind of going through life, being in a place where you know that your lived experience is not the default lived experience. And it's kind of this notion of, but is anyone default? And yes, some people can be, but at the same time trying to constantly revisit that.
Yeah. And sort of a related topic to these ideas of are you American enough and like what is your identity is that of microaggressions. This book definitely has a lot of conversations that are dealing with the sort of microaggressions that Mira Jacob faces, and it's very interesting the way that they play out and the way that she handles them as well. It's really interesting too because these are microaggressions for different aspects of her identity. She has microaggressions from people in her family, from people in India, from Indian guys who are trying to hit on her. So she has lots of that, but she has tons of microaggressions from people who are white in the US, and just seeing the different ways that people are, in a sense, chipping away at her because of her identity is really fascinating. I think that some of the ones that really stand out in my mind are, there's all of these scenes of her in a bar with different guys hitting on her in all of the offensive ways that she's hit on. You know, Indian guys who are basically telling her, you know, you shouldn't be dating non-Indian guys, they don't understand you. Or guys who are saying like, oh, I think Indian girls are hot. You know, these sorts of things that are just so demeaning and belittling in a lot of very minor ways. There's also a lot of interactions with some really problematic white people. There's one of a rich white lady who wants basically a ghostwriter and just dig after dig after dig at Mira, and just all of these things that are also not even understanding who Mira Jacob is. Things that, oh, because she's brown, she must be poor, or these sorts of things. There's also some that are really offensive that are with friends of her in-laws who are white Jewish people who live in Florida. And just some of the interactions with those friends of the family are just so upsetting. So I guess kind of everything from microaggressions to rather large aggressions, but the way that it's explored and I think the insight and the reflection that Mira Jacob has, while also acknowledging the humor in the situation, really, really comes through. And I found this was such a strong part of the narrative.
And I think the humor that you mentioned is really interesting, because as much as this book deals with heavy topics in many places, I would classify it as a humor book. It is actually a very light read. It's a very quick read. It's just beautifully done.
Yeah, it's one of those books that does that balance between serious and kind of recognizing the humor so well. I definitely cried at plenty of parts in this, and definitely laughed out loud at plenty of parts of this. And I think that it's that ability to take a step back and recognize what's going on and see the ridiculousness in the situations that makes it so strong, especially just given all of these microaggressions that she's constantly facing.
So another topic that I kind of want to talk about, which there definitely a lot of presence in this book, is that of the experience of the extended family among Indian diaspora and kind of your relationship with them. And by extended family, I mean your cousins, your uncles, your aunts, your great aunts, the works. Okay, so, and that it's common in a lot of Indian diaspora to stay in very close touch across all of these, and it's common back in India as well. So, and kind of associated with that, I kind of also want to mention that one of the common themes and problems is this lack of boundaries, and this kind of constant people putting their noses in others' business sort of a thing. And also kind of like the microaggressions thing you mentioned previously, there's a lot of just normal chatter, kind of like, oh, you're looking healthy. And what they mean by that is you put on a few pounds, and you know, that kind of fat shaming kind of a thing. And that, or I think something which is more common in the Western perspective is, are you seeing anyone, or when will I ever have grandkids? That's kind of the tip of the iceberg of the kind of things that you will get in a lot of Indian family reunions, and there are a few of those. So it's kind of like Thanksgiving for a lot of people, just continues over email and things like that. The Indian diaspora has adapted to new technology in lots of ways. Okay. So the other thing that I will also mention, and I'm glad it's being kind of called out in this book, is kind of some of the problematic aspects of a lot of Indian diaspora, of Indians being racist or colorist. And basically, on that note, I just want to quickly mention, after the recent round of BLM protests, one of the things that happened in India was there is this cream, this fairness cream called Fair and Lovely. And basically it's a skin whitening cream. And they acknowledge that their name might be problematic and that they're going to do better by changing their name to Glow or something of that sort. Okay, the product is still out there. The intent of the product is still very much the same, but they have fixed things doing that.
And if you're not familiar, skin whitening is really, really common throughout lots of parts of the world, but especially in Indian and East Asian communities, it's very common for people to always use skin whitening creams to try to get a lighter shade.
Mm-hmm. And there is an obvious thing associated with that the lighter your skin, the more high class you are. So
the more beautiful.
Beautiful, sorry.
It's
yes.
not just high class, it's
Yep.
also beauty. There's
Yep.
a lot of aspects of colorism that Mira Jacob talks about in this book, where because she has a slightly darker complexion than the other people in her family, she's called a lot of names and really
Like darky.
yeah, and just seen as not beautiful. And there's even an instance where there are some people who decide that she's just not worth knowing because she's too dark. It's just very, very interesting.
And I think the thing is, these things happen, and kind of it's good to see that being shown. So, and kind of on a related note, I also want to mention something. As Indians appear more and more in media in the West, one of the things that I have noticed some of the times is criticisms of Indian people being portrayed as racist in Western media. And I think that criticism makes sense from a perspective of saying that if it is framed in this way of saying, oh look, Indian people are racist too, it's fine for white people to be racist, then that's absolutely unacceptable, okay? But I think it's kind of like this really, what do you say, the criticism itself falls shallow for me because there are a lot of instances of racism in Indian diaspora, and I feel like not calling them out basically kind of erases an aspect of it which is problematic and should get better. Okay, so, and there's also associated with that, there's also one more thing that I noticed, which is this notion of veneration of hard work and dedication and sacrifice. I think sacrifice is a term that is common to a lot of immigrants in general, and I won't say that there is none of that. I mean, clearly there is a lot of that. And the kind of challenges you face going into a new country and not belonging and all that,
Poor baby.
I'm not going to understate that. But at the same time, the thing is, it's not like people back in India or whatever other country of origin are not also sacrificing and are also not, putting in a lot of dedication and work and things like that. So I feel like there's this chosen few mythos that I find very problematic. And it, to me, brings in shades of manifest destiny, okay? And that I find to be really annoying when I find it, okay? And I think that is something that is rampant in a lot of Indian diaspora circles. And to this end, since I find that majority media, which is for all practical purposes white, cannot really criticize these things easily. I'm happy to see increasing amount of own voices criticisms of this aspect, such as with this book. Or recently we watched Never Have I Ever in Netflix.
Oh, so good, by the way. Really good.
And I think it's like, look, there is a lot of humanity to a lot of this, but there are a lot of problems as well. So actually portraying that I find to be a really good thing. So I appreciated that a lot in this book. The other thing that I'll mention about Indian diaspora-ness, and I think almost just Indian experience even back in India, is this whole notion of arranged marriage versus love marriage. So in India, there's a concept that when you're marrying, it's not two individuals marrying, it's the families are marrying. And so from that perspective, and I talked about the whole extended family notion, so that continues into this. And so the notion is, kids should not make stupid decisions. Let the parents who are way more experienced at this, and with the help of aforesaid great aunts and things like that, help these kids along the way.
I think that there's also an idea that compatibility is based on similarity that plays into a lot of this.
And it's like, and the definitions of similarity are,
Yeah.
So
Can be things like the shade of your skin.
yes. So So I think there's a lot of that is part of a lot of Indian experience, and modern families are more accepting of love marriages where the kids choose partners for themselves, and it's kind of like even in cases where arranged marriage has become more of arranged dating. So in other words, the parents meet up first, figure out that their kids are going to probably be compatible. Then the kids get an email address of each other, and then you contact each other and see if there's anything there. And so this is all remarkably modern and kind of like,
yeah, it's just like a blind date type of deal.
And so you go on a couple of dates, maybe even 3 or 4. And then at the end of that, you can kind of like, you'll have parents calling every day and asking us, oh, how did it go? What do you think? Are we going to, have be allowed to send out notifications to a whole bunch of people that you're engaged? And it's like, that's the level of things. So it's kind of, it's a little crazy.
There's a really funny, if I find it, I'll link it below, skit where this kind of matched meeting is treated a lot like job interviewing, where it's like you have a couple of meetings to decide, okay, are we compatible? And then you have to make an employment decision, and it's like permanent. So it's very interesting.
And I think what's also really funny for me in all of this is back in the day, OkCupid used to have a blog of data applied to dating in a sense. And they had a lot of these statistics about races, how they basically interact with each other, which races were privileged above other races, as seen by each of the individual races, and that sort of a thing, right? Pretty much no surprises, white women can come out on top, and there's a bunch of things like that, right? But what was interesting for that is Indians were an outlier in that in most race combinations, in general, they were positively predisposed to other partners of their own race. With Indians, you were strongly negatively predisposed in comparison. And I think a lot of the arranged marriage hijinxes and people's experiences with this plays a part into that, is my personal expectation.
In that the people who chose to do online dating were trying to avoid dealing with the whole Indian diaspora stuff, and they're like, no, I don't want to be a part of this. I just want to find my own partner, and I don't want to deal with the other preconceived notions that other Indian people might have.
Yeah. And so it's just, I think this is almost a quintessential Indian experience, and it's silly and funny and a little bit tragic, and all of these
and
things.
It is not something that is outdated. I mean, that just like literally happens to all of the people that we know.
Yep.
Like all of the Indian friends that Sush has, his own family, this is just a thing.
This is a thing. There are matrimony sites where parents go and find other parents. So,
like online dating, but your parents do it for you.
Exactly. So anyway, so that I think is also a theme that is really common and is definitely explored in this book as well.
And I think what I really liked about the way that it was explored in this book is that it's not like it was just dismissed. It really was explored, and I feel like everything that Mira Jacob does in this book discusses a lot of these ideas, both recognizing the truth and the validity as well as the problems. So I really liked that way that she looked at everything.
And another part that I think you'll have a lot of the whole Indian big family expectations is generally the pressure that you feel from your larger family in order to be successful or to be worthy. And there's this whole notion of career choices. You either are a doctor or an engineer, or you have failed at becoming a doctor or an engineer. Okay.
I've heard cute little quotes, which is, you can be anything you want to be, any kind of engineer.
So anyway, I think this kind of problem is endemic to a lot of Indian diaspora. And I think there's also shades of that are appearing in this, despite her being very much of a different generation. And I don't just mean immigrant generation, I mean like age-wise as well, compared to me. And so basically, it's still funny to kind of see all of that play through. And I think the thing is, I have currently painted a very oppressive larger family figure. And that is true. But at the same time, I think there is still, despite all of this, there is a lot of love and connection, which also is true. And also is something that I see portrayed in this book pretty well.
Yeah, I think it's just a very nuanced depiction of a lot of these topics that really resonated. Sort of the flip side of all of this discussion of Indian families is the discussion of Mira Jacobs' in-laws. So her husband is white and Jewish, and there's a lot of discussion about kind of interactions with him, interactions with their son, interactions with her in-laws, and how race kind of plays an interesting part in those dynamics, especially because Mira Jacob and her son are experiencing life and the world by being visibly brown. Whereas even though her husband and her in-laws are Jewish, so not privileged in certain ways, they are also visibly white. And so the experiences that they have are different. I think that it was really, really interesting sometimes the way that Mira Jacob has to talk to her husband to get him to understand what's going on with their son, because he feels like their son is their son, and he doesn't always understand how he's going to be experiencing life differently. He doesn't always understand sometimes the underlying issues of why Mira Jacob is being treated in certain ways. So there's a lot of times when he's kind of dismissive of people treating her poorly, saying, hey, you should just not even deal with that person. You know, they're just being a total jerk. You should just say no to them, or you should tell them off, these sorts of things, without really acknowledging or understanding the degree to which just general pervasive racism affects that kind of blindness to a lot of the issues of race and how that affects things. I think that in our own relationship, I definitely have that sometimes where I'll think, oh, this isn't such a big issue. I'll just not realize that it's my privilege as a white woman to not see that it could be problematic.
And I think there's a notion of gender in there as well, because I think there's just a lot that I simply haven't been aware of on a day-to-day basis unless I'm paying attention, which is not as frequent.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that in this book, because Mira Jacob is both female and Indian American, we both see those aspects of how those kind of microaggressions and difficulties affect her in a way that her husband doesn't necessarily recognize. There was one of the stories in this which talked about her interactions with a producer for NPR who wanted to have her come on and talk about her book. That was very, very frustrating for Mira, and just kind of back and forth. And her husband just really didn't understand why she was even dealing with this guy. And it was just that lack of acknowledgement that she has to deal with this kind of thing all the time. You know, with these people dismissing her because she's female, or dismissing her because she's not white. And that lack of understanding, even though I feel like he in general is a very, very politically aware person. He's somebody who empathizes deeply, who cares deeply, but just doesn't always recognize where it's an issue of privilege rather than an issue of these people just being jerks.
And the idea of her not being able to opt out
Yes.
of that lived experience
Yes.
is something that he is blind to.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And similarly with her in-laws, there's just these experiences where she's like dealing with the friends of the in-laws who are being like racist, and her in-laws are like, what? But these are my friends. They would never treat anybody poorly, without recognizing the way that race plays into things. So I really liked the way that this examined that kind of interracial relationship, and the way that that can be something where you don't always understand and recognize what the other person is going through.
And kind of on that note, I also want to share a quote, because I found that Mira Jacobs' voice really, really shines through in this. And the quote I have is kind of like relating to the racist friends of her in-laws, right? Where her mother-in-law says, "Are you sure? I just can't imagine anyone actually doing that." And she responds saying, "We can talk, but not about how. I don't know what happened." And I think that's such a powerful voice And I love the groundedness and the character kind of shining through all of these stories. That really makes the book for me.
Yeah, just this calling out of, just because you're not experiencing what I'm experiencing doesn't invalidate my experience.
So one more thing I kind of wanted to talk about was, 9/11, or more specifically, the aftermath of 9/11, as seen by a lot of the Indian diaspora and other people. So I'm going to go slightly on a rant at this perspective, because I feel like I have a bunch of things to say. And I think the thing is this: there is a pervasive myth of America, of the US, having come together with 9/11. You know, yes, it did, but that also ignores a lot of realities. It ignores a whole lot of people that were not allowed to come together into that. It ignores a whole lot of people that many other people came together to unite against. Okay, and essentially, there is a lot of things that happen where, for a lot of people with brown skin, it was sort of a moment of living in fear in the US. Back in India, there were daily news reports constantly about how people were being beaten up close to death, some actually killed, lynching equivalents, and basically a whole bunch of people just living in fear. If I were to kind of focus on my experience, because that is what I can talk about rather than just generalizing to a broader perspective. I came to the US in 2005. And I can tell you that till about 2010-ish, I was randomly selected in airports for, further screening about 75% of the time. And that's not an understatement, okay? And in 2010, I took off my mustache. And after that, basically, I stopped being randomly selected as much. Now, whether it was because of the mustache or because I had assimilated enough to look American enough, or whether policies had just gotten better over the time, I cannot really say. Okay? But I do know what my experience was from 2005 to 2010. Calling it random selection is the biggest joke you can make of that. Okay? I can also tell you that I moved to Chicago in 2005, and I received stares wherever I went. And basically, yes, some of it is probably, and most of it is probably just curiosity, okay? But there were at least a few hostile ones thrown in there as well, and that never makes you feel welcome. So much for the Midwest friendliness or any of those kinds of things. And no, I do not think places outside Chicago would be better. I have had some amount of experience in like rural Indiana, if you want to throw that in, okay? Now, and also, in addition to that, in addition to the stares and things like that, there was at least one time when a person walked up to me and asked me if I was Iraqi. And when I told him that no, I was Indian, he walked away. Now, again, that might have been curiosity, but I don't know. I have been punched once, I have been spat at once. And again, I will never know if these were racially motivated or just random. But I do know that in 2007, I moved away from Chicago to California. And in California, there are plenty of other Indian people, and all of these just stopped. I stopped feeling like an outsider. And it's kind of one of those things where the difference was really, really stark. And to this day, I do not fully feel comfortable in the Midwest, and I keep the South at an arm's distance.
And I think what's really interesting too is in this book, Mira Jacobs grows up in New Mexico, where there are like just so few Indian people, but then she moves to New York City, and a lot of this happens in New York City, and she's in New York when 9/11 happens and like sees it. She can see the buildings falling, and she's there as all of these reactions are happening, and you feel that at first everybody's coming together, and then the distrust, and then the othering that happens to her. So I mean, it's not even big city versus small city. I think part of it is just that fear. So yeah, it's just really interesting.
Yeah, and I have a bunch of relatives who went around buying Stars and Stripes apparel at the time to show their patriotism and, that sort of a thing. And it's like some of it is wanting to be part of that coming together. Some of it is fear, okay, of what happens when you're left out, okay, and what happens if they unite against you. And that is kind of part of the Indian lived experience at that point of time as well. Now, the thing that I'll also mention in this is there's a lot of, again, nuanced conversation to be had associated with this, okay? Like a lot of Indians love to kind of bemoan and, kind of talk about how it's like, but we're not even the right country, or we're not Muslim, or this is the wrong type of brown. And the thing is this, all of that gets to this notion that there is a right type of brown to be angry at, or if you're Muslim, it is okay to hate, or any of these kinds of things. And these arguments have been made by other people as well. And it's also, in all of this, it is difficult to argue that with a person who is trying to, beat you up, okay? None of these conversations and all that, I mean, it can only happen in idle nature, so to speak, but it is a difficult kind of melange of, ideas and non-answers and feelings that are kind of wrapped up together. And I think this book does a really good job of portraying some of that, okay? So I kind of want to, I think I have this real problem in a sense of trying to read any book that covers World War II or 9/11 by, kind of like most authors, simply because I feel like there is a certain amount of glorification of the US identity that happens in that I cannot connect to. And I think the reality of nuance is very much missing in a lot of those. And there is some of that here. I also want to call out one more thing of this whole notion of othering, where the whole when you make an other the enemy, so to speak, okay? The same thing happened with Japanese internment camps and things like that back in World War II time frame, okay? Way worse than what happened to brown people in the 2000s, to be sure, okay? There's no question of comparison of order, okay? And I will say that you saw shades of that happen earlier this year as well with COVID coming out. And a lot of Asian people and Chinese people in particular were discriminated against by a lot of people, okay?
I think New York City had like a 30% increase in hate crimes against like Asian Americans.
And and I'm actually a little happy to say that after those initial smatterings, I'm not hearing of that much more. But whether I'm not hearing because they're not being reported or anything, I cannot say. I just hope that we are in a better trajectory now, So I think this whole notion of coming together is a narrative that I have problems with. I think there is a lot more nuance and shades of gray that happens over there that is just frequently ignored. And this is one of the few books that I think talks about that period, and from, the experience that I can kind of connect to, I guess, that delivers some of that nuance. This is not everything, but I think it does a good job on that end.
Yeah, and I think that kind of in general, this book does a good job of discussing difficult topics with nuance. Kind of related to all of the chapters that really talk about 9/11, also there are a bunch of chapters that talk about 2016. So 2016, with the election of Donald Trump and sort of all of the vitriol against brown people that happened during that election season and then since, is something that really, really deeply affected Mira, especially because her son was about 7 years old when that election happened. And he was asking a lot of questions, and she had to explain what was going on. And you see throughout the course of the book, from when it's just the kind of primaries, and you're hearing all of this vitriol in the rhetoric that Donald Trump was saying, and all of the questions that her son is asking her, and the reassurances that she and her husband gave their son of, okay, well, this is somebody who is saying very bad things, but don't worry, people will realize that this is bad, only for that to not happen. And in fact, for her in-laws to support strongly Trump's election. And so having to explain that to her son, but also to herself, right? To have to explain that this could happen, that this is the country that we live in, and really come to terms with what her place in the US is in other people's eyes. It was such a good discussion, and just very heartbreaking in a lot of ways to see those conversations with her son about race, the conversations with her husband and with her in-laws, and with her friends. It's just such a good discussion of all of those feelings and othering that happened.
And in all this, also trying to figure out what it means to be a good parent, constantly feeling guilty about falling short. And basically
I think that the feeling that she and her husband had with all of these reassurances they gave their son, only to realize that those are all empty, and that she can never make the world safe for him. Oh, it was heartbreaking. Okay, so as I hope you can tell from our discussion of this book, it was just fantastic. It's not just that Mira Jacob is such an amazing storyteller who mixes all of this humor with heart, with reality, with political discussions, with explorations of identity, but it's also that it got us to think and got us to discuss. It's just so many topics that are covered in this are really important issues that I hope everybody will read and discuss as well. And I think that one of the things that makes this collection so impactful is that often the way that these conversations hit you is such an unexpected surprise. Often they're just conversations that she's having, and then at the end she'll bring it all together and show you kind of what that deeper meaning is, and just you have all of this insight and reflection and epiphanies that come from it. It's really, really moving. It is such a great read. Because each of these is a separate little conversation, it almost reads like a series of interconnected short stories. It's just so worthwhile. I hope that you guys pick this up if you haven't already. If you have read this, or if you have any thoughts, any comments, any recommendations for any books that are similar to this, anything at all, go ahead and leave us a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you.